Hello.
Hi Delphi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
It's good to see you.
Oh, it's good to see you too. And thank you for swapping today um and doing it in the day rather than at night. I appreciate that.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. I was trying to remember when we last spoke, and it was probably a bajillion years ago. So
Yeah, I'm
around
thinking maybe like a decade or something. I'm not sure.
it was. It probably was. Scary
Yeah.
times.
Oh my gosh, just I am recording this and I thought I'd just record from straight off, but we know each other through O Books, don't we? Where we published together books and things back in, well, my first books, and I imagine yours as well.
Yeah, so my first book has only just come out, but it's been about 10 years in the writing. So
Oh my gosh.
I know. So it's a very long story, but yeah, it's there. It's made its way. But yeah, so I think we first connected through the High Heeled Guide to Enlightenment. I think was that your first book? I think
The first book, yeah.
first book. So I actually have a copy right beside me. It's on my bookshelf. So yeah, that's kind of where I think you and I, and then I think you had a cafe, you had an online
Soul
cafe.
Cafe,
Yeah.
which is kind of what this is. This is the upgraded, I'm now 10 or so years older, Cosmic Sisterhood. So it kind of took, because I did the Soul Cafe and then got pregnant, and just it was just like, oh ah. And part of me wishes I'd kept that going, actually.
Things happen.
Yeah, I couldn't hold space for baby and Soul Cafe. But yeah, this is like the Cosmic Sisterhood is kind of is Soul Cafe rejigged and sort of 10 years on. And we started in lockdown. So
I
yes.
love it. I love the title of it. It sounds really like a really healing space.
Yeah, I hope it is. I mean, we meet, we have people like yourselves come, people that I know generally, that I've met who can, talk to us about what they do. Women, especially, well, we've not had any men yet. I guess we might at some point, like as a guest, one day pass. But yeah, to just explore people's spirituality, the things that they do. So if you're okay, can we just jump straight in and I'll ask you some questions. You can tell us all about you.
Mm.
Although I am also wondering how it took 10 years to write a book, but I know these things take time. And so this book is this book that's just come out, isn't it then? Answers in the Dark.
Yes. Yeah, and so the reason why it took 10 years was because when I first had the idea to write this book, one of the traps that I fell into was I was really, really keen to make sure that I got all the jargon right. And so the book started to lean into a very sciencey, very jargony type of book, and it just didn't sit comfortably with me. Whenever I kept reading the manuscript, it didn't feel like me coming across in the pages. And then one day I was working with, several years later, I was working with a group of women who were going through a really difficult time. And we were talking about sleep and we were talking about dreams. And one of the ladies turned around to me and said, "You need to write a book," not realizing that I was already writing a book. And I just sort of jokingly said, "Oh, I'm trying." And she said, "You need to write it like you talk."
Right.
And so that was really, it's all thanks to the ladies in that group that it kind of gave me the inspiration. So I basically went back to square one and I started again. And so although it still applies the science, it still talks about the science and the relevance of it, it's more like me talking to someone. Lots of people have said when they read the book, it's like they can hear me speaking. It's like I'm having a conversation with them. And that's really where I wanted to go with it. I wanted to make it more personal. I wanted to speak from the first person rather than, how a lot of sciencey academic work, not that it's wrong, but it comes from the third person and it just didn't connect for me. So
Accessible as well because of that, isn't it? And I think it's a really feminine approach to write in the first person. It's like screwing up years and years and years and centuries of tradition, a male orientated tradition of how to write about these things, and making it our own. And you see it with a lot of people. It's how I wrote my books, and you have to give yourself permission to do that. It's hard.
Yeah, exactly that. And so that's why when I read the final manuscript, I remember, and I'm sure you can relate to this, that sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, having been working for hours on the book in the days previously, I remember finishing the manuscript at, I don't know, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And I remembered reading through some of the pages of it and chuckling to myself at some of the things I've written, and, you know, thinking I'm really enjoying this. And of course, the ultimate test was I sent it to my mum.
The acid test. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean it is, isn't it? And she just wrote back and said, I love it. So for me, that was kind of like the testimony. And then of course I sent it out to a few people and asked them to have their thoughts on it. And yeah, people just came back with the loveliest feedback and comments. So I think for me it was very much about finding my way back to that authenticity, coming back to center, and just saying, okay, I'm going to do me, I'm just going to write this my way, and kind of, there's plenty of space in the world for those academic jargony type books, and I say that in Answers in the Dark, I say that, there's plenty of space for those types of books, but it's not my book. And then my book is more about, let's be human centered, and let's look at this from meet people where they are and see how that goes.
Yeah, and it does make it so much more accessible, which is what I've always done with my books. Is I wanted to make ideas that are usually kind of highfalutin up here and inaccessible to many people.
Yeah, I love your writing style. It's very, very similar to mine.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to confess I haven't read yours yet, and my reason why is because we have been redecorating, and my husband has done something with all my books. So I don't know. I think they're in the attic. So
I feel that on a very deep level. We are very much in a sort of similar refurb stroke redecorating position at the moment. This is probably the only room which is quite sort of whole at the moment. Everything else is sort of mid something.
Do you know what it's forced me to do, though? It's forced me to finish books that I'd started that I had out elsewhere, like tucked in cupboards. So I finished a few books, some of which have taken a couple. Sometimes there's books that you start and they're really good, but for whatever reason you don't finish them. Maybe it's not the right time, but I finished them. But now I need to get those books, and Answers in the Dark is my next one to read because I'm fascinated. Honestly, sleep fascinates me. Our dreams fascinates me. Grief, I'm one of these, I think, abnormal people who, I'm 44 years old on Saturday and I've barely experienced much loss. But that does mean that I feel that it's coming, Yeah,
sure. I totally hear you. And one of the things that I talk about in Answers in the Dark is I make the point that if COVID taught us anything, it's that grief doesn't just belong to death. You use the word loss there, and that's so relevant because most of us, if we look back at some point in our lives, we'll be able to identify with experiences of loss, even if it wasn't the physical death of someone. And if COVID taught us anything, it was that grief doesn't just belong to death. It belonged to, the relationship breakdowns that happened for so many people in the early days of the pandemic, when people found themselves in spaces with people they just realized they didn't want to spend the rest of their lives with, or people being made redundant or furloughed. And that really sort of visceral feeling of disconnection from the world around us for so many. Don't get me wrong, many people have said to me that for some of them, lockdown was actually quite healing because it gave them space to pause and to reconnect with the things that mattered to them. But for many people, especially if you align yourself with someone who's a hugger, then, to all intents and purposes, we've been hug deficient. We haven't had our reasonable quotient of hugs. And so I think that sense of loss was palpable. And for so many people, they were starting to connect with this idea that grief isn't just the loss of a loved one. It can be the loss of anything that matters to us that's no longer there. That could be a way of life. It could be a lifestyle. You know, even having a baby, to some extent, there's an element of loss involved with that. You know, whether it's your old lifestyle, that, you know, your job, if you choose to work from home, or choose to spend time at home with the baby, and things like that. So I think for many people, that recognition of loss was quite strong. But at the same time, and this is where it gets tricky, is that society doesn't get that. And I talk about society in the book as this amorphous entity, is how I describe it, this completely faceless entity which has a very loud voice. And so society has this idea about what we can and can't grieve for. And I talk about this in the book as disenfranchised grief. So that is where we have experiences of loss, but society doesn't recognize it as a reasonable reason to grieve. And so what then happens is people come out with platitudes, or they come out with these really unhelpful phrases. They usually start sentences with "at least." So, you know, at least you're still young, you can always get remarried, or, you know, at least you can get another job, or at least you have a roof over your head. But all of these things, especially when you are really feeling that sense of loss, can feel quite minimizing and be quite disempowering. So I think many people are starting to connect with this idea of grief as something outside of the death of a loved one, but at the same time, they're not being given permission to grieve by society at large. And so, as I describe in Answers in the Dark, their grief goes underground because it has nowhere to go. And of course, it's just resting underneath awareness. And if it has nowhere to go, it will show up in your dreams, or in not being able to sleep at night. So, you know, you can keep yourself as busy as you like all day, but as soon as your head hits the pillow, your bed becomes this magical place that reminds you of everything that's ever happened to you. So I think that's where we're starting to connect with that.
I'm really feeling that. I'm really thinking, wow, you know, maybe society can't cope with stuff, and it, like you say, it gets suppressed and put down internally. And do you think then that COVID gave us an opportunity where we were so undistracted by anything that we processed a lot of this loss and grief through our dreams?
Well, we know that in the early days of the pandemic, dream recall, according to the Lyon Neuroscience Centre, dream recall was up 35% at the beginning of the pandemic. So people who may have never remembered their dreams before, for whatever reason, were finding themselves suddenly remembering their dreams. And for some people, that will be a very practical thing. You know, if you're laying in bed a bit later in the morning because you haven't got your morning commute, you know, if you were working from home, for example, if you're laying in a little bit longer, then you're dreaming for a bit longer. And so it stands to reason you're more likely to remember them. But I do think there's a practical element to it as well, from the perspective of people may well have started to reflect, you know, maybe showing some level of curiosity towards their feelings and their experiences, and that then in turn was showing up in their dreams. And I mentioned in Answers in the Dark that our problems are like a hole that we walk around during the day but fall into at night. And it's one of the reasons I say that it will either show up as not being able to sleep, and your mind can be so noisy in the stillness of night. I explain in the book, I have a whole chapter called Going Down the Plug Hole, because that's what it feels like, you know, like your thoughts just spiral and take you into this dark place. And it's very hard once you're down there to get back up. And so I think for some people that will have been part of it, but also there will have been a real kind of connection to memories from the past. So, you know, other experiences in their lifetime that perhaps, as I say, were resting underneath awareness, would suddenly start to show up in their dreams. And so I think for many people, there was this real sudden awareness of, you know, what am I being told right now? What messages am I being given through my dreams? What is my mind trying to tell me? What is the universe trying to tell me? However they connect with that. And so, yeah, I think there was a real essence that it was time to start paying attention.
And what does paying attention do? So if we start to pay attention to our dreams and kind of bring it into our consciousness, is that a healing process, or is that just the beginning of a healing process? Or you tell me.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because for me, dreams are like a friend. They're that friend that is the observer, that can see things that we can't on a conscious level. You know how when a relationship breaks down and your friend says, oh, I never liked them, you know, it's almost like that. It's like dreams are like that. They can see things that we're perhaps not on a conscious level, either willingly not seeing or subconsciously not seeing. We're so busy or we're so distracted that we're just not able to see it. So friends are very much like dreams are very much like friends. They're very much giving us insight into what's happening for us. Having said that, I think for some people, they have trained themselves not to pay attention, and this shows up where, for example, they might not remember their dreams. You know, especially if you've grown up in an environment where you were told when you were younger your dreams don't mean anything, you know, your dreams don't matter, then you're less likely to pay attention to them when you get older. But of course, what tends to happen is when they really get your attention is as a nightmare or a really distressing dream, and that's when we tend to pay attention to it, or we may try to understand it. But it's like anything, and this is one of the reasons why I encourage people to keep a dream diary, because you'll start to see patterns in your dreaming. You'll start to see why you dream about certain places, certain people, certain events, especially following a bereavement. So if you have experienced the death of a loved one, you will find, for example, around certain anniversaries, whether it's their birthday or whether it's the anniversary of their death, you may well find that you have specific dreams. And so for me, dreams are also, as well as a friend, they're also a form of nighttime therapy. They're a way of processing during the night what we're perhaps not ready to look at during the day.
Yeah, I recently had a series of dreams. I didn't have a lot going on, and it felt like a very sort of quiet moment in life. And during that time, I had like 2 weeks of just vivid, crazy, intense, interesting dreams. And I was quite at that is sort of ebbed off a bit now, but I was very much enjoying it. And it was a bit like going to the cinema in my head, but it did feel like this stuff was loaded. It wasn't just, you know, watching a film that had nothing to do with me. It had characters and familiarities and themes definitely running through it. And I wish I'd written them down. I didn't, but
yeah, but it's so interesting though, isn't it? One of the points I make in Answers in the Dark is that the dreams aren't always the subconscious rattling of your mind though. So if we take examples like Stephanie Meyer, who wrote the Twilight Saga, you know, the story of Bella and Edward. Yeah. When she woke up in the morning, she dreamt that book. She dreamt the Twilight Saga from start to finish. And when she woke up in the morning, she didn't sit down and get out her dream dictionary and think, well, what's the symbolic reference of wolves? What's the symbolic reference of vampires? She knew she'd been given a book. And throughout history, there's examples of people who've used their dreams creatively to, you know, to make money, for want of a better way of putting it, whether that was their intention or not at the time. They use their dreams creatively. So they're not always this kind of subconscious rattling of, you know, past experiences or what's troubling us or our worries and fears and frustrations. Vincent van Gogh said, I dream my painting and then I paint my dream. Keith Richards dreamt the riff to I Can't Get No Satisfaction. He apparently keeps a guitar and a notebook by his bed, and if he wakes up with a song on his mind in the morning, he writes it down. So, you know, I think this is why we can expand our idea about the purpose of dreams to being more than just this kind of psyche, you know, this kind of exposed element of what our mind is trying to tell us, and maybe expand it into this discussion around, well, what else, you know, what else could they be offering?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, do you believe that is a spiritual process that's going on?
Yeah, I think for me, and one of the things that I'm really careful to say is, I think certainly in the West, we have fallen into the trap when we start to talk about dreams. People start talking about people like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, who existed 100 years ago. But we have been talking about dreams for thousands of years. There are recorded documents in history. You can find some of them in the British Museum, of people throughout history who have discussed their dreams and the relevance of them and the importance of them. So I think we have to be careful, especially in the West, where we've fallen into this trap of thinking it's all about Freud or it's all about Jung. And that's not to say they didn't bring something to discussion. They absolutely did. But if we only look at dreams from one perspective, like Freudian or Jungian analysis or archetypes, we're only getting one bite of the apple. And so we do need to expand the idea. In certain other countries, you know, in Eastern traditions, in Aboriginal culture, you know, dreams are still to this day an essential part of everyday life. And so I think this is one of the reasons why we have to be careful that we don't just put it down to the neuropsychology of the dreaming brain, you know, that we don't try and blast it all with neuroscience, and that actually we listen to people who are saying, but what about the dream I had which came true? Or what about when my dead loved one came to me in my dream and it was as real as day? You know, I think we do need to make space for those conversations, and we do need to consider the possibility that there's more to it than just this kind of neuroscientific element. That's not to say that the neuroscience isn't important. You know, we can look at that from all different types of perspectives as well. But I do think we need to make space for people who are saying, but you know, what about when I lucid dream? Or what about when I had exactly the same dream as my mum or my best friend, which is called mutual dreaming? So, you know, all those kinds of things, I think we do have to make space for that. And so for me, there is absolutely a spiritual element to it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the experience. I've had a poem come to me, I remember once in a dream, and writing that down. I also had quite recently a book I did. I don't really believe it. I don't remember the dream. I just woke up with an entire fully formed book in my head, and it was a book that I'd presented to some places a year before and that they'd wanted, and I couldn't get my head around it, and they kind of rejected it in the end because it wasn't formed, and I couldn't get it into my head what I needed to do. And then I woke up like not long ago, a few months ago, and it was like literally it was there. I was like, oh, that's what I need to do, and it seemed so obvious. And yeah, and then there was the dream where, you know, Jason Momoa was my boyfriend. So, you know,
those kinds of dreams. I love those kinds of dreams. And it's so funny. I was talking to someone the other day, and I was saying that I once dreamt that I was pushing Vin Diesel, the actor, in a shopping trolley. And as you do. And I was saying that when we talk about dreams and this sort of the ethereal connection, you know, this idea that we are to some extent traveling to another time and space, whether it's in our minds or whether it's in the universe or whether it's through other forms of traveling. What if that night Vin Diesel dreamt that he was being pushed in a shopping trolley by a British woman he didn't know? Do you know what I mean? You just don't know.
Someone in his imagination, yeah.
Exactly. You know, and what if he woke up the next morning? I mean, I don't know, because obviously I haven't asked him, unless if I ever meet him, I certainly will. But you know, it's one of those things, isn't it? We just don't know. And that's another reason why, yes, I can absolutely look at that from a symbolic perspective. You know, I can absolutely start to dissect that in terms of what is this encoded message trying to tell me. But at the same time, I do also keep a space in my mind for the possibility that who we dream about also dream about us in some way, shape or form. Even if it wasn't that night, you know, it might have been at another time. So again, I think that's why we just need to keep the doors open. I don't think we should be closing any doors around, you know, and saying, well, dreams mean this. And an example of that is because years and years ago, there was a theory that was kind of put out into the scientific community that dreams don't mean anything. They were simply random images that, you know, was just being produced by a brain that was at sleep. And unsurprisingly, a fair percentage of the scientific community rejected that theory, because if that was the case, if dreams were just simply a case of random images, we wouldn't be able to interpret them. We wouldn't be able to wake up and say, oh, yes, I know why I had that particular dream and I know what that means to me. So we know that they're more than just these random images. But so that's why I say we have to kind of make space for all these possibilities, and see what feels best for us, you know, see what sits comfortably for us.
So within your work, do you sit with people and kind of dissect their dreams? Do you do that kind of thing, or do you use it how do you work with dreams?
So in the old days, and I've been doing this work for a very, very long time. In the old days, I used to call myself a dream analyst or a dream interpreter. But I have always thought of it more as an exploration. So I very rarely will sit down with someone and say, oh, you dreamt this, therefore it means that. I don't think I've ever done that. what I tend to do with people is I tend to say, well, what does that mean for you when you dream, when you think about lions? If a lion appears in your dream, when you think about lions, what does that mean for you? And that's why in the book, in Answers in the Dark, I'm very careful to say it's not a dream dictionary. It's more a toolkit for helping people to understand and interpret their own dreams, because I ultimately believe that the best person to decide what their dream means is the dreamer, is the person who had it.
Yeah.
I can come along, and I do in the book, I offer insights into certain types of dreams. I talk about anxiety dreams. I talk about death dreams quite significantly in the book, because those are the types of dreams that tend to worry people the most. But I talk about it in the context of themes rather than saying, if you dream this, it means that, because we all grow up with our own ideas and symbolism about what something means. So an example of that would be, if I use the example of the dream of losing teeth, which is one of the most common dreams that people have across cultures. So cross-culturally, the dream of losing teeth is quite universal in terms of people have that dream throughout the world. But if you look at it in different traditions, the interpretation of it is completely different. So in the West, what do we do with our teeth as children when they fall out? We exchange them for money. And so in the West, dreams of losing teeth can often be about a fear of losing status, financial difficulties, worrying about money, status, all those kinds of things. But in other parts of the world, teeth are seen as a symbol for life. They're seen as a symbol of death. And again, that's not that death is going to happen. It's a recognition of the cycle of life and death, or that death often represents change rather than it being about death itself.
And so like tarot cards, but like
tarot,
the death card that's the same kind of thing I'd be saying about that.
Exactly, I was thinking that as I said it. And so that's an example of how these kind of things are different dependent on your heritage, your background, your upbringing, your culture, your traditions. And I will add to that sex is another one. Sex in dreams, I talk about this in the book. Sex is probably one of the most misunderstood symbols within a dream. I think it's something like only 4% of dreams about sex are actually about sex. The majority of dreams about sex are about either control and power or about connection. And depending on what's happening in the dream will be relevant to the interpretation of it. So if I dream that I'm having fantastic sex with my boss, which I would never do, and in the dream I'm loving it, but I wake up absolutely mortified because I just wouldn't do that in waking life, then it may well be to do with my relationship with my boss, the power struggle, the power connection with that person, how connected I feel to that person, and that kind of thing. And so again, that's why I think dreams can be literal, but often they speak in metaphor, and those metaphors will often be quite unique to us as individuals.
Yeah, I'm trawling through my dreams now in my head, and I don't remember a lot, but I do know there was one where I was like in love with Bob Geldof. We didn't have sex, right? But we were just hugging, and it was just lovely. And this was way back. Bob Geldof was not a crush of mine at any point in real life. He was just an old man who did the Band-Aid and all of that. But after that dream, I did feel quite slightly in love with him for a while. It had felt so real. And now I'm just thinking, like, maybe it's because of, that caring, he wants to heal the world and that caring thing. And maybe that's what I was kind of craving is.
Absolutely that. Celebrities can definitely be symbolic in our dreams rather than them being, I literally just wrote a blog article about this actually, because so many people, when the Queen died, so many people, even people that didn't align with the monarchy, that wouldn't describe themselves as royalists or anything like that, people started describing what I refer to in the article as unexpected grief. So they were feeling a sadness that they couldn't put their finger on because they didn't know the Queen, they hadn't met the Queen, but nevertheless they were feeling this unexpected sadness. And one of the things I talk about in the article is that the Queen symbolized something to many people. So whatever that symbol was, she may well symbolize something. The Queen was the most dreamt about woman in Britain at one point. When they did a survey of sort of famous people that we dream about, the Queen was at number one. So I think this is one of the reasons why again, people can be symbols. It's not just an object like, you know, a banana or a book can be a symbol for something in a dream, or a cat, but people can as well. And so again, it's worth, like you said, Bob Geldof perhaps symbolized for you that I want to heal the world, I just want to make the world a better place, and you know, those kinds of things. So yeah, makes total sense.
Yeah, it's magic. I love it. I'm going to try and hold back on telling you all my dreams now. But yeah, oh my gosh. And I can see the Queen one as well, you know, even just in waking life, it's quite surprising how often the Queen has sprung to mind, you know, because we're so conscious of obviously what's happened. And I went to say the other day to my daughter that I didn't carry cash like the Queen. And then I was like, oh my God, it's like, it's in the language, it's in everything, you know? So gosh, no wonder people dream and feel a sense of loss, because all of those things that we've known since, for most of us have known all our lives, and now like moods, it's bizarre.
I remember when Chester Bennington, the lead singer for Linkin Park, died.
I
cried for 2 days. I've never met him. I had never been in the same space with him. I'd never even been to a Linkin Park concert, and yet I cried for 2 days. And the reason for me was I just felt such a connection to his music. I'm getting tearful just saying it. And it's because I know that I will never hear a new song from him again. And his music spoke to me in really precious ways. So I think that's, again, it's not the personal ways necessarily, but what they represent. And so I think it's why we see outpouring of grief. Princess Diana, Princess of Wales, that was another example. We see this outpouring of grief because also I think it gives us permission to grieve. Seeing other people grieving gives us permission to grieve. So even if I didn't know the Queen or hadn't met her, I was fortunate enough to actually go to a garden party. So I did meet the Queen once, in a manner of speaking. Yeah. But even if I hadn't, you know, for some people, even if they haven't met them, then they will be, you know, for her, that for them, she may well have symbolized something. So I think it's important. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier about disenfranchised grief, because I saw people on social media saying, well, why are you so upset? You never met her, you know, and that kind of thing. That's disenfranchised grief. That's how it shows up. That's what it looks like, where society is sort of saying, I don't get it. You've got no right to grieve for that. You've got no reason to grieve for that because you didn't know her. And yet actually on some personal, visceral level, there's a real connection to that person, even if we've never met them.
Yeah, I guess it's the grief of our own losses, and also the fact that we all die and how sad and unfair that can feel at times. I found myself watching the Queen's funeral quite sad about the fact of the big to-do that was being made about her, and all the people who won't have the big to-do. That's what got me. That was something that came up for me. Like the lonely people, the sad people, people without families who won't even be remembered. That triggered me. No,
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think, again, I think it just brings up something quite individual for each of us. Again, even if we don't necessarily know that person, there may be something about that taps into our own sense of loss, which by extension then gives us permission to grieve for it. Especially if, like I say, it's resting underneath awareness. I remember once speaking to someone, and this is an example of how you know, emotions certainly for men sometimes have they're not always given permission to grieve. I remember someone telling me once that they'd learned about the death of a loved one, and they were told quite explicitly, big boys don't cry. And the day I met them, which was decades later, they still hadn't cried decades later. And that's an example of how that language is so insidious. You know, it almost like permeates us. And that becomes part of our rule book. You know, part of our rule book then dictates how we then navigate life and love and loss. So if we then give people permission to say, well, actually, it's okay to cry, as I did with that person, then there's a freedom in that. And sometimes that happens with these big occasions, like when we lose someone famous, because it then gives us permission to cry for the things we've loved and lost.
We can leak it out, I guess. And I'm just wondering as well, talking obviously about dreams and grief, and what do you think about dreams that feel like they are visitations from people that we've lost? Because I've had a couple of those with the only two people who are particularly close to me who I've lost have been both my grandpas. And I wasn't sadly wasn't that close to them. One lived in America and one was all the way down south, and was lovely but also a difficult person to connect with in reality. But I've had dreams of both of those that I felt quite close. And I just wonder, is that something within me, or is it their spirit, or a bit of both? Or
so I talk about this in the book, and I have a whole section on visitation dreams, because I essentially put visitation dreams into two categories. So there's the type of visitation dream where a person appears to a person in their dream, someone who's died comes to that person in their dream, and there's something about it that just feels magical. So that person will wake up the following day thinking, wow, that was really special. And so they will have a sense of calm, they'll have a sense of peace, that everything is okay. And sometimes they'll even get a little message from that person, whether it's again in the form of a symbol. So I remember someone once saying they were given a box, and when they opened a box, a butterfly flew out. But then other times they will be given a literal message, which may be along the lines of, I'm okay where I am, just get on with your life, or, you know, those kinds of things. And those types of dreams for me are the classic, authentic visitation dreams. And again, in many cultures around the world, these dreams are used and recognized as visitations and information from spirit to encourage people to live their life healthily and in a meaningful way. The other types of dreams, and this comes back to what I was saying about nighttime therapy. So some of my work and my background is predominantly in bereavement, so supporting people who have lost a loved one. And one of the things, it wasn't designed this way, but it just so happened that the majority of people that I've worked with have been bereaved by murder and suicide. So I've been to coroner's court and supported people through that process. And one of the most common dreams that people will have when they've had to navigate that experience is they would often have the most difficult dreams of their loved one coming to them and maybe saying something unkind or something cruel, or they would appear to them in the dream and they look unwell or they look distressed in some way. And obviously that would be very distressing for the dreamer. And the way I describe those dreams is as nighttime therapy. There's some unresolved or some unfinished business around the loss of that loved one. And because we try so often to keep ourselves busy during the day so that we're not thinking about the awfulness of it, it will show up in our dreams at night. So our dreams give us this nighttime therapy, the opportunity to work through those feelings of, I should have known, I should have done something different. What if I'd done this? What if I'd done that? And our dreams give us the space to do that safely without us trying to grapple with that during the day. So for me, those types of dreams, they're not the traditional classic visitation dreams. They're more nighttime therapy. That's us trying to work out what was going on, you know, and what's happened and how we're feeling about that loss. Whereas, as I say, the more traditional, authentic visitation dreams, that's when you'll wake up in the morning and think, that was amazing, you know, that's something really special has just happened. So that's pretty much how I define them.
Yeah, I think I've definitely had a visitation dream then. I'm just thinking when my grandpa, the one who was difficult to connect to in real life, he came in a dream and he was wearing his army uniform from when he was young, and we were having a picnic and he kept hugging me, and he was never a hugger. That he was like, in real life he would shake your hand, even his grand would shake your hand. It was all very formal. Wow. But it kind of goes in line with also having been to a couple of psychics. The only time I've been to a psychic, he's the only person who ever comes through, and he always comes through with this, I'm sorry I was like that in life. I didn't know how to be. There was reasons why I was like that.
That lovely. And yeah. I think that's the classic for me. That's the classic visitation dream. And interestingly, just to pick up on what you said, in a classic visitation dream, people will often appear in their visitation dreams as their younger selves. So when they were healthy and happy, perhaps like you said, wearing a uniform or something that they identified with. I remember when my dad appeared to me in a visitation dream. My dad died when I was quite young, and when my dad appeared to me in a visitation dream, he was, as I always knew him, but he was very happy and very relaxed, and just looked like he'd always looked. You know, there was nothing. Whereas in his older years, he started to look different. You know, look more poorly. And certainly for those of us that have actually seen their loved one die and know what they look like when they've died, I know a lot of people worry about being able to get that image out of their head. And so for me, the visitation dream, when I think of my dad now, that's how I remember him, is in that dream, and how relaxed he was and just looking like his normal self. So yeah, so I think that's the classic visitation dream, is when you wake up feeling like something really special has just happened. There are people who would love to have a visitation dream from their loved one and never do, and I think that's another thing that I think sometimes people grapple with, is, well, why, you know, why didn't I have a visitation from them? Why haven't they come to me? And my answer to that is there could be any number of reasons, you know, depending on how busy you are, depending on how you've processed that grief, depending on where they are, you know, on where they are in their journey, you know, may well be a reason why they haven't come to you. And also I think because sometimes in visitation dreams, people come to us because they need to, you know, we might not be doing so well, we might not be coping so well, and so they'll come to us to reassure us that wherever they are, they're okay. But equally, sometimes they'll come to us to pass on something very practical. My mum once told me that my dad came to her in a dream after he died, and she woke up the next morning and she picked up the phone and she said to me, "I've got to tell you, your dad came to me in a dream last night and he said that you must sign the document." And I said to her, I said, "What document?" She said, "I've got no idea. I genuinely don't know what this document is, but you must sign it." And I still don't know to this day. I mean, I've been signing lots of documents. I still don't know to this day, but it's that kind of thing where there was a message delivered and it was passed on that way. But there was certainly nothing sinister about that. I don't buy into the idea that dreams are a portal to evil or anything like that. I think often when
Never even heard that idea.
no, I don't buy into that at all. Dreams are your friends. They are there to offer wisdom, guidance, insight, perspective. That doesn't mean that we might not occasionally have tricky characters in our dreams. We may well have people showing up in our dreams who are behaving in unkind ways, but that doesn't mean that because when we're asleep the veil is so thin that we've opened up a doorway to something. That's not the case. Dreams are very much a divine portal. If they're a portal at all, they're a divine portal, and they're giving us space to connect on another level. You know, especially if you buy into the idea of the Akashic Library and, you know, the unconscious consciousness and that kind of thing, then that's more what dreams are all about, rather than, you know, anything dodgy going on. Anything dodgy going on in a dream is for us to reflect on personally in terms of a period of growth, rather than, you know, anything on the other side.
Oh my gosh, Delphi, I just feel like there's so much. I feel like we could literally talk about this all day, but we will have to wrap it up because I have my biscuit and book event shortly.
I love that.
It's so cute. I did my younger daughter this morning, and now I've got to go back and do the older one, and we eat a biscuit and we look at books together. It's for half an hour. It's kind of,
I think I'm going to go and do that myself. I think I'm just going to go and make tea and have a book and a biscuit.
Yeah, but thank you so much. What I will do is I'm going to find that book of yours that my husband has hid, and I'm just looking around. It's not up there. There's a couple up there, but it's not there, sadly. And I'll get the group, the Cosmic Sisterhood, to get copies if they haven't already, because I have spoke about you coming, and we'll do a little book club on it. And I literally, dreams are like one of my favorite things to just dive into and learn about. So I can't wait to read that. And yeah, how can people find you?
So the book has its own website. They can go to answersinthedark.com and it gives them all the buying options. So if they don't want to buy from Amazon, for example, they can buy elsewhere. But they can find me at delphiellis.com. They can see some of the work I've been doing in other arenas as well. So if they want to find me, they can find me there.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely fascinating. I'm going to go have a look too. And maybe you'd like to come back some point, and we can do a live session perhaps with some people and with the women, and maybe take some questions or something if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I'd love that, Alice. And thank you so much for making space for me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for reaching out after all this time and sending me your book, which I now need to desperately go find. So thank you. All right, Delphi, have a wonderful rest of your day.
And you, speak soon.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.